Hi, Joshua. I am Sophia Soto with the Nerds of Color, and it is such a pleasure to speak with you today.
Hey,
Huge
Sophia.
congrats on the series.
Thank you. Pleasure to speak with you too.
First off, I wanted to ask you, you play the title role. What attracted you to this project originally, like made it stand out to you, and how did you get yourself into this character?
Well, what attracted me in the beginning was just how outrageous this man's story is. So my first entry point was a conversation with the executive producer, Patrick McManus, and he gave me all sorts of information. But what he said basically is just go listen to the podcast, and then you'll have an understanding of what the story is, and we can talk again. And when I was listening to the story, it's incredibly compelling. It's incredibly creepy. And it is hard to wrap your mind around how a person like Christopher Dunch could not only exist, but be able to thrive for long enough to do the amount of damage that he did. So that is instantaneously compelling. It's just the podcast is brilliant. It's a really well told story. And then, thinking about playing this character, because my first instinct when I listened to the podcast was to think, well, this guy's a psychopath. And that's it. He's just an evil human being who did terrible things. And that's kind of a boring character to play, honestly. And so I got into the conversation with Patrick, and he said, well, no, he's not a psychopath. He thinks he's the victim. He actually thinks he was doing good work. And he thinks he was undermined by the people around him. And if these mere mortals could have just got on his level, then everything would have been fine. And that's a much more interesting character to play, because then you have this total disconnect from reality inside of this, this central character. So once I was able to stop judging him and play him as he saw it himself, it unlocked all the rest of the pieces of the character.
Yeah, and then, like you said, the podcast, and then being inspired by this true story. Had you heard about it before this, and did it affect you all while reading the scripts?
I mean, I hadn't heard about it before. I was a complete newbie to it when I got into the conversation with Patrick. And yeah, it's deeply affecting. I mean, listening to the podcast, I felt like I wanted to take my spine out of my body and just put it someplace safe.
Yeah.
And when you read the scripts, like I said, the hardest part for me was to just stop judging him, because I kept on trying to find why he's crazy, right? Like, he's clearly doing this because he's a psychopath. It can't just be that he's a kind of sociopathic narcissist and incompetent, and the system supported him above these other human bodies. And so the story is ultimately much uglier than just a crazy person did bad things. So yeah, I found it deeply affecting. I mean, there's some, without giving away, there's some things that he does inside of the telling of this story, which are true, that are just unforgivable evils committed against other human bodies. And yeah, you wear that around when you're playing it, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And, I wanted to ask you, what are you most excited for fans to see from this series? And is there a sort of message you think they're going to receive? Because it is really telling of this insane events.
I mean, well, I think the first thing everybody should receive from this is get a second opinion. I hope that people will just be engaged by the story, first off, right? Because nothing else comes through if you don't find the story engaging. And if we tell it right, I hope at some places you'll find yourself compelled, or maybe even sympathetic for Christopher Dunch, because you don't want him to be as bad as he so evidently is. And I think that feeling that we have of wanting to give credit to a doctor, wanting to give credit to somebody who has some surface level charm and navigates spaces well, is exactly the problem, right? And I guess it's sort of beware the smiling devil. Because this man was able to create absolute havoc, and he was able to do it inside of systems that were literally built to support him, right? As a tall, blue-eyed, he was blue-eyed, tall, blue-eyed white man with a degree. The world was set up for him to be able to create the havoc that he did. And maybe we need to give just slightly less credit to people like that, and rebuild our systems so that they're more equitable.
I have a little creative, fun question for you.
Excellent.
Tag. If you could create either a tagline, your own tagline, or a phrase to describe what is to come with this series, what would it be?
Well, I guess I just hit my tagline, which is get a second opinion.
That is, listen, that's perfect. Plastered it on all the posters.
Yeah.
And then when you sat down, to hear the project, did you hear it in full and knew everything that was going to happen? Or when you sat down to read those scripts, did the elements just shock you?
The elements were shocking. So from my conversation with Patrick, he sent me to the podcast. So I listened to the podcast. So I knew the podcast's telling of the story, but the podcast telling of the story is sort of a historical account of this man through his trial. The story of the show is slightly different because we really go inside Christopher Dunch's life in a way that the podcast doesn't, and in a way that a podcast doesn't really lend it to, but the moving image does. So I was familiar with the podcast, but in reading the scripts and sort of having his life and the path that led him to this place revealed to me, it was still shocking page by page by page. And as I was reading it the first time, I kept on finding myself wanting the answer, right? Wanting the simple thing that tied it all together. Like there has got to be a reason, right? And it's just much more complicated than that. It's much more complicated and much more difficult than just a simple answer.
Yeah, definitely. Those are the best types, though. Honestly, when you're searching for that.
Exactly. I found it. I find like when I read something and I'm as the actor reading it for a character and I'm like flipping through trying to get like what where are we going, and that generally translates to a very good story. So I'm actually quite proud of this. So I think we did a good job of translating it from the page to the screen, but that's on you guys to judge.
Well, I watched some episodes, so I can say I judged it very well, and I agree with everything you said. So thank you again so much for taking the time to speak with me. Congrats again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.